When your own flesh and bone strips away your name, your home, and your future over a single disagreement, the silence that follows is deafening. Thomas was left with absolutely nothing in his pockets until an old, rusted iron key from a dead man unlocked a century-old empire of lies. The biting November wind whipping off Boston Harbor felt like a physical punishment, but Thomas Gallagher was already numb. At 28, he was supposed to be sitting in a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Gallagher Tower, managing high-yield portfolios and dining at exclusive clubs in Beacon Hill. Instead, he was standing in the mud of a South Boston salvage yard, his hands blistered and black with grease, wrestling a rusted transmission out of a wrecked sedan. He was earning $14 an hour under the table. It was all he could get after his father, Richard Gallagher, made a few phone calls. In the span of a single afternoon, Richard had not only fired Thomas, but blacklisted him from every financial institution on the eastern seaboard. The memory of that day, exactly 14 months ago, still played in Thomas's mind like a warped film reel. He had stumbled upon a series of encrypted offshore accounts while auditing a routine merger. The numbers didn't add up. Millions of dollars were being siphoned from their clients' pension funds and funneled into shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. When Thomas brought the files to his father, expecting righteous indignation, he was met instead with a cold, calculating stare. His sister, Caroline, had been in the room, pouring herself a glass of aged scotch. She hadn't even looked up as she delivered the killing blow. "Grow up, Tommy," she had sneered, swirling the amber liquid. "How do you think grandfather built this empire? By playing nice? You put those files back, or you walk out that door and you never come back." Thomas had chosen to walk. He thought his moral high ground would shield him. He was wrong. Within 24 hours, his trust fund was completely frozen, legally tied up in a labyrinth of discretionary clauses his father controlled. His credit cards were cancelled, the locks on his Back Bay condo were changed by a private security firm. When he tried to contact his friends, he found his calls ignored. No one wanted to risk the wrath of Richard Gallagher. He was systematically erased. The only person who might have defended him was his grandfather, Henry Gallagher, the patriarch who had founded the firm. But Henry had been sequestered in an exclusive assisted living facility in Connecticut for 3 years, his mind reportedly ravaged by severe dementia. Richard controlled Henry's power of attorney, meaning Henry was essentially a ghost in his own family, until he became a literal one. The news had reached Thomas 3 days ago, not through a family phone call, but via a tiny obituary in the back pages of the Boston Globe. Henry Charles Gallagher, 86, passed away peacefully. Thomas didn't attend the funeral. He knew the presence of the disgraced son would only give Richard an excuse to cause a scene. Instead, Thomas had stood outside the wrought iron gates of Mount Auburn Cemetery in the freezing rain, the collar of his cheap thrift store jacket pulled up, watching from a distance as a sea of black umbrellas gathered around the mahogany casket. He mourned the man who used to teach him how to whittle wood on the porch of their summer home in Nantucket, long before the money had poisoned their bloodline. "Hey, Gallagher." The harsh voice of his foreman snapped Thomas back to the miserable reality of the salvage yard. "Someone here to see you. Looks like a Fed." Thomas wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked toward the chain-link gate. Standing there, looking utterly out of place amidst the crushed metal and oil spills, was a nervous-looking man in a bespoke grey suit, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest, as if the dirt itself might steal it. Thomas recognized him instantly. Arthur Sterling, a junior partner at the law firm that handled the Gallagher estate. "Arthur," Thomas said, his voice raspy from disuse and the cold. "What are you doing in this part of town? You'll ruin your Ferragamos." Arthur swallowed hard, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked terrified. "Thomas, I shouldn't be here. If your father finds out I bypassed him, he'll have me disbarred. But I had strict, irrevocable instructions. Prior to his mental decline, your grandfather established a blind trust and a contingency that bypassed Richard entirely." Thomas's brow furrowed. A contingency for what? Arthur hastily opened his briefcase, his hands trembling as he pulled out a thick, wax-sealed envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, bearing the distinct, heavy crest of the Gallagher family. He made me swear to hold this in a safety deposit box until the day he died, and he made me swear to deliver it to you, directly into your hands, in secret. Arthur shoved the envelope toward Thomas, almost dropping it in the mud. Take it, please, and forget you saw me. Before Thomas could ask another question, Arthur turned and fast-walked back to a black town car idling at the curb, fleeing as if he were being chased by hounds. Thomas stood alone in the biting wind, staring down at the heavy envelope. The wax seal was broken. The emblem of a lion standing over a shield cracked down the middle. He retreated to the small, unheated shed he used for brakes, locking the flimsy wooden door behind him. His frozen fingers fumbled with the thick paper. Inside, there was no check. There were no stock certificates, no deeds, no grand declarations of hidden wealth. There was only a single piece of heavy cardstock, and wrapped tightly inside it, a large, antique brass key. The key was heavy, coated in a fine layer of green patina, indicating it was decades old. The teeth were jagged and complex, unlike any modern lock. Engraved into the flat bow of the key were 3 letters and a date, L.T.M. 1921. Thomas opened the cardstock. The handwriting was unmistakably his grandfather's sharp, slanted, and entirely lucid, written with a fountain pen. Tommy, if you are reading this, it means Richard has finally shown you his true face, and I am gone. I am sorry I played the fool at the end, but feigning madness was the only way I could hide my final moves from your father without him having me killed. Yes, killed. Do not underestimate the monster I raised. The empire is built on rot, Tommy. You know a fraction of it, but the truth goes deeper than offshore accounts. The wealth does not belong to us. It never did. I could not bring myself to tear down my own legacy while I lived, but I cannot let Richard use it to destroy more lives. The key belongs to the origin. L.T.M. Seek out the belly of the beast in the north. Find the rusted door. The ledger is the foundation. Burn it down or build it right. With all my love. Grandpa Henry. Thomas sat on an overturned milk crate, his breath pluming in the freezing air of the shed. His grandfather hadn't been crazy. He had been terrified. And he had left Thomas the one thing Richard Gallagher didn't have, the truth. It took Thomas 3 days of agonizing research on a slow public library computer to decode L.T.M. 1921. The letters didn't stand for a bank, a holding company, or a private club. They stood for the Lowell Textile Mill. In 1921, Lowell, Massachusetts, had been the booming epicenter of the American textile industry. According to public records, Henry Gallagher had started his career not as a Wall Street savant, but as a low-level accountant at the Lowell Textile Mill before making a sudden, miraculous fortune in the stock market right before the crash of 1929. The mill itself had shuttered in the 1970s, a victim of outsourcing and changing times. Most of the massive brick complex had recently been converted into overpriced loft apartments and artisanal coffee shops. But the public zoning map showed one small, isolated wing of the factory, Building 4, sitting right on the edge of the Merrimack River, that was legally condemned. It had never been renovated. The owner of the deed was listed as a shell company called Aegis Holdings, a subsidiary of a subsidiary that Thomas knew from his days at the firm, eventually traced back to Richard Gallagher. Thomas quit his job at the salvage yard that morning. He pawned his last valuable possession, a vintage Omega watch he'd managed to hide in a sock drawer when he was evicted for $800 cash to fund his trip. By dusk, he was stepping off a commuter rail train in Lowell. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening snow. He pulled his collar tight and began the 2-mile walk toward the river. As he navigated the winding, cobblestone streets, a prickle of unease crawled up the back of his neck. He stopped abruptly in front of a storefront window, pretending to look at a display of antique furniture. In the reflection of the glass, half a block behind him, a man in a dark peacoat stopped too, turning his attention to a street lamp. Thomas's heart kicked against his ribs. It was Declan Hayes. Declan was an independent contractor who worked exclusively for Thomas's older brother, Preston. Preston was the golden boy, the ruthless heir apparent who handled the family's more unsavory problems. If Declan was here, it meant Arthur Sterling had talked, or the family had been monitoring Thomas's library searches. They knew he was onto something. Adrenaline flooding his system, Thomas broke into a brisk walk, turning sharply down a narrow alleyway that smelled of damp brick and old garbage. He heard the heavy thud of Declan's boots breaking into a jog behind him. Thomas sprinted. He burst out of the alley, crossed a 4-lane street dodging blaring headlights, and vaulted over a rusted chain-link fence that bordered the Merrimack River. Below him, the dark water rushed aggressively over jagged rocks. To his right, looming against the dying light, was Building 4 of the Lowell Textile Mill. It was a decaying, 5-story monolith of red brick. Most of the windows were shattered, gaping like missing teeth. Faded white letters painted on the brickwork barely spelled out LTM. Thomas scrambled down the muddy embankment, slipping on wet leaves, moving toward a set of heavy wooden loading doors on the basement level. He glanced back. Declan was at the fence, peering into the gloom, reaching inside his coat for something heavy and metallic. There was no time to be quiet. Thomas grabbed a piece of discarded rebar from the mud and smashed it against the heavy padlock securing the loading doors. It didn't break. He swung again, fueled by a year of pent-up rage and betrayal, striking the rusted metal with a deafening clang. The padlock shattered. He ripped the doors open, throwing himself into the pitch-black maw of the basement, and pulled the doors shut behind him just as a beam from a heavy-duty flashlight swept across the mud outside. Thomas stood perfectly still in the suffocating darkness, his chest heaving, listening to the muffled crunch of Declan's boots walking right past the doors. He waited 5 agonizing minutes until the footsteps faded entirely. Pulling his cheap prepaid cell phone from his pocket, Thomas used the weak glow of the screen to illuminate his surroundings. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, asbestos, and decades of stagnant dust. Huge, rusted textile looms sat like dormant iron beasts in the shadows. "Find the rusted door," the letter had said. He moved deeper into the cavernous basement, navigating through a labyrinth of rotting support beams and collapsed ventilation shafts. The deeper he went, the more the architecture changed. The brick gave way to reinforced concrete. At the very back of the basement, hidden behind a false wall of stacked molding wooden crates, Thomas found it. It wasn't a standard door. It was an antique, heavy-duty bank vault door, forged from solid steel, covered in a thick layer of reddish-brown rust. There was no combination dial, only a massive, intricate keyhole right in the center of the wheel. Thomas's hands shook as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key. He stepped up to the door, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly, but wouldn't turn. The decades of rust had seized the internal tumblers. "Come on," Thomas hissed, gripping the bow of the key with both hands. He planted his boots against the concrete floor and twisted with all his might. The metal ground against metal, emitting a horrific, high-pitched screech. For a second, he feared the key would snap in half. Then, with a heavy, satisfying thunk, the tumblers gave way. Thomas grabbed the rusted iron wheel and pulled. With a groan that echoed through the entire basement, the massive vault door slowly swung outward, breaking a seal of stagnant air that rushed past his face. He stepped inside, raising his phone screen. It wasn't a vault filled with gold or cash. It was a perfectly preserved office, untouched since the 1930s. A heavy mahogany desk sat in the center, but what caught Thomas's eye were the walls. They were lined, floor to ceiling, with hundreds of green metal filing cabinets. Sitting squarely on the desk was a leather-bound ledger, thick and heavy, beneath a layer of dust so thick it looked like grey snow. Thomas walked over and wiped the dust away. Engraved into the leather were the words, "The Aegis Trust, Beneficiaries and Assets, 1,929. He opened the heavy cover. The first page contained a handwritten confession, signed by Henry Gallagher, dated October 24th, 1929, the day the stock market collapsed. Thomas read the spidery handwriting, his eyes widening in absolute horror as the greatest twist of his family's legacy unveiled itself. If you are reading this, my sins have finally caught up with me. The Gallagher fortune is a fiction. I did not earn it. I stole it. In the chaos of the crash, I diverted the life savings of 4,000 mill workers and the pensions of the very people who broke their backs in this factory into a private trust to save myself from ruin. Every dollar Richard flaunts, every building with our name on it, belongs to the descendants of Lowell. Here, in these cabinets, are the names of the true owners of the Gallagher empire. Thomas dropped the ledger onto the desk, his mind reeling. His family wasn't just corrupt. Their entire existence was built on the stolen futures of thousands of working-class families. They weren't titans of industry. They were parasites. Suddenly, the blinding beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the darkness of the vault, illuminating Thomas's terrified face. Well, 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 a smooth, chilling voice echoed from the doorway. Thomas spun around. Standing there, holding a suppressed pistol leveled directly at Thomas's chest, was Declan, but he wasn't alone. Stepping out from behind the hitman, wearing a pristine cashmere overcoat that looked entirely alien in the rotting basement, was Thomas's brother, Preston. I have to admit, Tommy, Preston smiled, a cold, dead expression in his eyes. Father always said you were too stubborn for your own good. Now, step away from the desk, or I'll have Declan leave you in this vault to rot for another 100 years. The silence in the underground vault was heavier than the steel door that guarded it. Thomas stared at the barrel of Declan's suppressed pistol, then shifted his gaze to his older brother. Preston looked immaculate, his tailored cashmere coat unblemished by the grime of the condemned mill. He looked exactly like their father, arrogant, untouchable, and entirely devoid of a conscience. "How did you find me?" Thomas demanded, his voice echoing off the rows of green filing cabinets. He subtly tightened his grip on the heavy, leather-bound ledger resting on the desk. "You really think you're the first person to look for grandfather's little time capsule?" Preston sneered, stepping carefully over a pile of decayed floorboards. Father knew Henry was hiding something. When the old man started losing his mind, he babbled about Lowell, about the sins of 1,929. Father spent $2 million on private investigators scouring this city, but Henry had buried the paper trail under 3 different shell companies. When you vanished from your miserable scrapyard job today, we knew Arthur Sterling had finally delivered the missing piece. Preston gestured dismissively toward the ledger under Thomas's hands. "It's over, Tommy. That book is a relic, a ghost story. You think anyone cares about a bunch of dead mill workers from a century ago?" "This isn't just a story, Preston," Thomas countered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tapped the thick cover of the ledger. "This is proof of grand larceny. The seed money for Gallagher and Sons was stolen. The trust belongs to the descendants of these workers. If this goes public, the Securities and Exchange Commission won't just fine the firm. They will dismantle it. They will freeze every asset, seize every property, and pierce the corporate veil. Father's entire over-leveraged portfolio will collapse overnight." For a fraction of a second, the smug mask slipped from Preston's face, revealing genuine panic. Thomas had hit the nail on the head. The Gallagher empire was built on a house of cards, and this ledger was the stiff breeze that would topple it. "Which is exactly why you are going to hand it to me," Preston said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He nodded to the hitman. "Declan, take the book. If he resists, shoot him in the knee. We'll tell the police he was trespassing in a condemned building and fell on some rebar." Declan stepped forward, the gun leveled steadily. "Easy now, rich boy," the hitman grunted. "Just slide it across the desk." Thomas's mind raced. He was trapped in a subterranean vault with a trained killer and his sociopathic brother. But Preston had made one fatal miscalculation. He was arrogant enough to stand in a room that had been rotting for 80 years. Thomas looked at the massive, floor-to-ceiling metal filing cabinets looming directly behind Declan. The bottom shelves were eaten through with severe, reddish-brown oxidation. They were buckling under their own weight. "You want it?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking not just from fear, but from a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline. "Take it. Thomas grabbed the heavy brass key from the desk and with all his might, hurled it directly at Preston's face. Preston yelled, throwing his hands up as the heavy metal struck his forehead, splitting his brow open. In that split second of distraction, Declan flinched, his aim wavering. Thomas didn't run for the door. He lunged to his right, throwing his entire body weight against the weakened, rusted base of the largest filing cabinet. Metal shrieked. The rusted legs snapped like dried twigs. The massive 10-foot-tall cabinet tilted forward, the center of gravity shifting irreversibly. It crashed into the cabinet next to it, triggering a catastrophic domino effect. Hundreds of pounds of steel and decades of dusty files cascaded down like an avalanche directly onto Declan. The hitman roared in pain as a cabinet crushed his shoulder, his pistol discharging wildly into the ceiling. Chunks of concrete and plaster rained down on them in the suffocating darkness. Thomas didn't hesitate. He snatched the 1,929 ledger off the desk, shoved it into his jacket, and bolted for the vault door. "Get him!" Preston screamed, clutching his bleeding face, blinded by the plume of toxic dust filling the room. Thomas tore out of the vault and sprinted blindly through the cavernous basement. He could hear Declan swearing violently behind him, scrambling out from under the wreckage. He didn't head for the loading doors. They would expect that. Instead, drawing on the architectural blueprints he had memorized at the library, Thomas veered left toward the old water intake tunnels that fed from the Merrimack River. Crack! Pff! A suppressed bullet chipped the brick wall inches from Thomas's ear, spraying his cheek with sharp shrapnel. He dove behind a rusted textile loom, his lungs burning with the asbestos-laced air. He scrambled on his hands and knees, sliding down a steep, slick, concrete embankment into the drainage tunnels. The water at the bottom was waist-deep and freezing, a shocking cold that stole the breath from his lungs. Holding the ledger high above his head, Thomas waded furiously into the darkness. The tunnel echoed with the rushing water, masking his splashing footsteps. He waded for what felt like miles, his limbs going numb, hypothermia creeping into his blood, until he finally saw the faint, orange glow of a street lamp bleeding through a storm grate above him. Using the last reserves of his strength, Thomas pushed the iron grate open and hauled himself out onto the freezing, wet pavement of a deserted Lowell street. He collapsed against a brick alleyway wall, shivering violently, clutching the stolen history of thousands of lives to his chest. He had survived his family. Now, he was going to destroy them. By the time the sun rose over Boston, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, Thomas was sitting in a brightly lit, sterile conference room in the John F. Kennedy Federal Building. He was wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, sipping a bitter cup of stale coffee. Sitting across from him wasn't Arthur Sterling, but Evelyn Vance, the assistant director of the regional FBI field office, alongside two lead investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. Thomas had walked straight into the federal building at 5 a.m., demanding to speak to the highest-ranking agent on duty, slamming the water-damaged, but perfectly legible 1,929 ledger onto the security desk. Evelyn Vance slowly closed the ledger, carefully removing her reading glasses. She looked at Thomas, her expression a mix of profound disbelief and predatory focus. "Mr. Gallagher," Vance began, her voice calm but loaded with gravity. "I've been hunting your father's financial anomalies for 6 years. We knew he was hiding assets, but we thought it was standard tax evasion. This," she tapped the leather cover, "this is a foundational fraud on a scale I haven't seen in my entire career. It implicates the very charter of your family's trust." "I know," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "My grandfather stole the mill workers' pension funds to survive the crash. My father knew. My brother knew. They've been using that stolen capital as collateral to secure billions in corporate loans." "And the hitman?" the SEC investigator asked, furiously taking notes. "Declan Hayes. He's likely still in Lowell, along with my brother, Preston. They tried to execute me in Building 4 to burn this book. I want full immunity for my cooperation, and I want an immediate freeze on all Gallagher & Sons assets before they can wire the remaining capital to the Caymans." Vance didn't hesitate. Done. The following 48 hours became a media spectacle that rocked the global financial markets. It started with a coordinated FBI raid. Black tactical vans surrounded the Gallagher Tower in downtown Boston. News helicopters captured live footage of Richard Gallagher, the untouchable titan of finance, being led out of his own glass lobby in handcuffs, looking frail and utterly bewildered. Preston was arrested at Logan International Airport, attempting to board a private jet to Zurich with a bruised face and a fake passport. Declan Hayes was apprehended hours later at a cheap motel, nursing a shattered collarbone. The story dominated the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. But the real earthquake was the revelation of the victims. A coalition of massive class action law firms, led by prominent civil rights attorney David Rosenthal, took on the case pro bono. Using the meticulous records in the 1929 ledger, investigators began tracing the genealogy of the 4,000 original mill workers. The Gallagher fortune, artificially inflated over a century of ruthless investments, was valued at just over $4.2 billion. Once the SEC finished dismantling the firm, liquidating the assets, and paying the federal fines, the federal courts ordered the entirety of the remaining trust to be distributed to the living descendants of the Lowell textile mill workers. For thousands of working-class families across New England, teachers, mechanics, nurses, and factory workers, it was a miracle. Generations of stolen generational wealth were suddenly returned. Debts were paid off, mortgages were cleared, and college tuitions were funded. Thomas Gallagher received absolutely nothing. Because he was technically a beneficiary of the fraudulent trust, the federal asset forfeiture stripped him of any legal claim to the family money. He was left with exactly what he had the day his father fired him: nothing. But as Thomas sat on a weathered bench in the Boston Public Gardens 6 months later, watching the swan boats glide across the pond in the warm spring sun, he felt something he hadn't felt in his entire life. He felt light. His phone buzzed in his cheap denim jacket. It was an email from David Rosenthal. The subject line read, "The Final Disbursement." The body of the email contained a list of the last 100 families who had received their checks. Attached was a photo of an elderly woman, the granddaughter of a loom operator, crying tears of joy on the porch of a home she no longer had to surrender to the bank. Thomas smiled, locking his phone and tossing it into his pocket. His family had disowned him to protect an empire built on blood and rust. But in the end, it was the discarded son who used a rusted key to finally balance the scales. He stood up, breathing in the crisp city air, ready to start a life that was finally, genuinely, his own. If Thomas's journey from a disowned son to a whistleblower inspired you, hit that like button and share this video to expose the hidden truths of billionaire empires. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more incredible real-life dramas and untold stories of justice. What would you do if you found your family's dark secret? Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear your thoughts.